Hi guys, welcome to the channel. This is my take. If you're new, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for further content. For those of you who don't know, this video is part of a 4-part video series on liberal nationalism and how to defeat the populist right. In this video, we're going to cover the basics, explaining what populism is, why it's a problem, what its root causes are, and why responses so far by the mainstream and by the left have failed so badly. I assert that the left and the center cannot abandon patriotism or national identity, and rather than trying to suppress nationalism, they should come up with a positive alternative to the kind being advocated by right-wing populists. Hence, liberal nationalism. In part 2, I'm going to flesh out this concept and explain how it works, because I know some of you are already thinking, liberal nationalism, isn't that an oxymoron? Well, it's not. So watch part 2. In part 3, we're going to look at empirical evidence to show why liberal nationalism can work. And in part 4, we're going to look at some of the practical ways that liberal nationalism can be implemented. Anyway, let's get down to it. Starting off with the basics. What is populism? Essentially, populism can be understood as a thin ideology that pits the virtuous, pure people against a corrupt, out-of-touch elite. So this makes it anti-elitist, but it's also anti-pluralist because it assumes a kind of general will of the people rather than a heterogeneous society where different people have different and often conflicting interests. Scholars also make it clear that populism is not the same thing as nationalism or authoritarianism. Although many, especially right-wing populists, combine populism with these elements, populism at its core is a thin ideology that can attach itself to thicker ideas such as socialism or nationalism. So populism can range from right-wing to left-wing, with right-wing populism, which is what I'm going to be focusing on in this video series, focuses on cultural concerns and pits the people against a cultural elite, while left-wing populism concentrates on economics and rails against the economic elite. Although populism is not the same thing as nationalism, nativism, or authoritarianism, these features are often present in right-wing forms of populism. So, where populism pits the people against the elite, nativism pits the people against a perceived outgroup. So when you combine the two, nativism and populism, the pure people are pitted against an elite that is allied with outsiders against the pure people. Now that we've got that done, what's actually wrong with populism? Why is it a threat to liberal democracy in the first place? Well, let's quickly cover what liberal democracy is. Democracy is simply a political system where the people have power, and that's usually expressed through free democratic elections. But most Western countries are more than this. They are what we call liberal democracies. That is to say, they don't just have free elections, but also elements of what is called constitutional liberalism, which includes things like the rule of law, separation of powers, separation of church and state, civil rights, and civil liberties. So let's be clear here, guys. There's nothing wrong with being against the elite. I mean, I'm against the elite. Populism goes wrong, however, with its anti-pluralism. What makes populism a threat to liberal democracy is that populists assert that popular sovereignty, so the democratic part of liberal democracy, should be respected at all costs. In other words, at the cost of the liberal part. This is what Fareed Zakaria calls illiberal democracy. So populists argue essentially that democratic institutions are products of the elite and that the checks and balances formed by these institutions therefore form illegitimate barriers to the true expression of the will of the people. And you see this, for example, in Viktor Orban's shutting down of independent universities in Hungary, or Donald Trump's demonization of the media, or the Polish government's decision to rein in the judiciary. By claiming to be the exclusive representatives of the people, populists dismiss any opposition as illegitimate through its attempt to bypass the popular will. In essence, what populists are saying is not we are the 99%, they're saying we are the 100%. And anyone who opposes us is not part of the people because they're not part of the 100%. So populists deny pluralism and equate a part of the people who support them, with the whole of the people. And in this way, populism tends toward a kind of tyranny of the majority politics. But the whole point of liberal democracy is that people cannot vote to take away your rights, even if they are the majority. And this attitude is reflected by, for instance, what Trump said at one of his rallies. He said, "The only important thing is the unification of the people, because the other people don't mean anything." That's dangerous. So I hope it's clear to everybody that the anti-pluralist nature of populism and the nativist and exclusionary nationalism that characterizes right-wing kind of populism is what makes it a threat to liberal democracy. Alright, so let's move on to the causes of populism. The typical populist voter tends to be, on average, older, male, lower educated, more religious, and a member of the ethnic majority. And basically, scholars have identified four main causes of populism: economic insecurity, negative partisanship, the tension between responsiveness and responsibility, and cultural insecurity. Essentially, the economic insecurity argument is the one you guys have all heard before. It's the economically left behind, the losers of globalization, who now resent the political elites and sometimes immigrants as well. And there's some evidence for this. While it's true that populist voters do tend to be lower educated and lower income, the statistical academic analysis shows that populist parties did not in fact win significantly more votes from people who are at rock bottom. So they do win from people who are generally lower educated, but not those at rock bottom who are dependent on social benefits. And if you actually break it down, populist voters by class, you found that it's not the working class that's most likely to vote populist, but the petty bourgeoisie. So your small-time shopkeepers or self-employed electricians, those kind of people. So it's a mixed picture. For negative partisanship, it's essentially the idea that you don't vote for someone, but rather against someone. This is basically how Trump won. He won only a third of the Republican primary vote, but all the Republicans lined up behind him because they couldn't stand Hillary Clinton. Even in multi-party systems, you kind of see the same effect because populists frame the debate as either you vote for us or for the establishment, which is all the other political parties. And so people often vote for populists not because they like them, but simply because they hate the other parties more. Then the tension between responsiveness and responsibility is essentially the idea that because we're living in a globalized world, politicians feel pressure to act responsibly with regard to international institutions such as the EU and the IMF, without necessarily being responsive to the needs of voters. A great example of this is when Greece was in the financial crisis. Establishment politicians had to implement harsh austerity measures in order to comply with the demands of the EU and the IMF, so responsibility. But there was massive opposition to this from Greek society, so the politicians were not responsive, and this led to the rise of the left-wing populist party Syriza. And finally, we have the cultural insecurity theory as the cause of right-wing populism. Essentially, this is the idea that there's a growing backlash among ethnic majorities to the cultural changes that many Western societies have gone through, and these cultural changes are mainly the result of rapid demographic change, mass immigration, and multiculturalism, leading to increased support for the kind of anti-immigration policies that are touted by the populist right. Now, there's a lot of evidence for this thesis. Most studies show that attitudes to immigration are the primary statistical predictor of voting for populist right parties. Additionally, rapid demographic change in an area is highly predictive of support for right-wing populists. And so, more than the absolute number of immigrants or minorities, it's more so how fast the change is that is threatening to people. So what you see is that this effect actually wears off over time as people get more used to established minorities, which kind of explains why you see that it's often the areas with the least immigrants that vote the most for the populist right. Yeah, this basically brings me to the question of how to defeat the populist right. We know that right-wing populists use nativism and exclusionary forms of nationalism, so it almost seems logical to resist this phenomena by rejecting nationalism altogether and promoting a liberal cosmopolitan post-national future like the European Union, for example. However, I argue that it's precisely this approach that has helped to fuel right-wing populism by threatening national identity and thereby creating the sense of cultural insecurity that strengthens the appeal of nationalist populists. The overly enthusiastic hailing of a post-national future by European elites has come crashing down in the wake of the Euro crisis and the migrant crisis, which provided a lot of the fuel for the Eurosceptic populist sentiment. Basically, what I'm saying is that a collective European identity does not exist at present. And there are even numbers to back this up. Look, people who tend to think of themselves as European represent the more privileged members of society. Those people who are higher educated, have higher incomes, are younger, are able to travel, etc. But overall, just 12.7% of those in Western Europe think of themselves as Europeans, while 44% think of themselves exclusively in national terms. Even the 43.3% of the electorate who think of themselves sometimes as European still primarily identify with their nation first. So essentially, 87.3% of Europeans think of themselves primarily in national terms. So it seems unlikely that a post-national European identity can serve as the basis for collective identity that can challenge nationalist populism. Now, another manifestation of this kind of liberal cosmopolitanism you see in some elements of the liberal left. Some on the left argue that, for instance, the American identity is its diversity, or that we are united by our diversity, or even argue the fact that because we are so diverse means we should not have a national identity at all. Now, to say that the US and increasingly Western Europe is diverse is a true statement, it's a fact, but it cannot be the basis of a national identity. Saying diversity is our identity is like saying not having an identity is our identity, or saying we have nothing in common and should therefore focus on narrow racial and ethnic identities. This is a mistake. And increasingly what you see is that some people on the left who totally reject any national attachments, for instance, Sean King, who says that figures like Thomas Jefferson should not be celebrated at all on the grounds that he owned slaves, ignoring his contribution to the liberal founding ideals that made America possible in the first place. This outright rejection of national identity in pursuit of social justice is only going to alienate those members of the ethnic majority who value their attachment to the nation. This kind of over-the-top liberal cosmopolitanism is precisely what has led to the populist right bashing against such things as the liberal elite or political correctness. And it also leads to negative sentiment against minorities, because by rejecting all aspects of national identity in pursuit of social or racial justice, what you do is frame minorities or immigrants as the cause of the ethnic majority's feeling of cultural insecurity. This is a bad strategy. So neither European identity nor the kind of diversity is our strength, anti-national kind of talk can form coherent responses to the sense of cultural insecurity that is driving the rise of right-wing populism. What we need instead is an approach that can create a balance between the need for national inclusiveness, tolerance, and liberal values on the one hand, and the need for a sense of national belonging and collective identity on the other. I call that approach liberal nationalism, and I'll be explaining what that is and why it's not an oxymoron in part 2 of this video series, so stick around, like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.